Hello guys, Charles here and welcome back to my channel. So if you've ever wanted to create outside sounds like that, then this is the video for you. This video should help players who want to expand their non-traditional scale knowledge and add more colour to their playing. So that sound world you just heard there has been used by musicians including Frédéric Chopin, John Scofield, and as far as guitarists go, probably most notably, Robben. So of course that sound was the diminished scale, which happens to be Messiaen's second mode of limited transposition. Now we outlined what all that means in the previous video, which was mode 3, which you can watch up here, but for the sake of this video, let's quickly recap some of the main points. So Messiaen was a 20th century French composer, and although he didn't invent these modes, he compiled them and pioneered the use of them in his own compositions. And the diminished scale is also scale number 5 in Allan Holdsworth's Just for the Curious course. Now the diminished scale has 8 notes, whereas mode 3 that we looked at in the previous video had 9 notes. Therefore, there's slightly fewer options available to us with the diminished scale. However, there's still plenty of chord types that this will work over, and the great thing about the diminished scale is it has 2 modes, one of which is a truly diminished sound and one of which works really nicely in an altered dominant context, and we'll be breaking down the 2 differences in this video. John Scofield said that in jazz today you hear a lot of these chromatic lines that are not really scalular, and a lot of that is coming from the diminished scale. So as I said in the opening to the video, it's a really great way to start to explore those outside chromatic sounds. So all of the examples in this video are going to be built on the root of A. Let's start by learning the structure of the diminished scale in its 2 modes, and then we'll move through and look at some of the harmony, and we'll finish by showing you how to play that lick that I opened the video with, and some creative ways of using this scale without it sounding too symmetrical. So we're going to start by learning the scale on a single string so we can really see the structure of it. Now the diminished scale starts on its root, as every scale does, and then it's a simple repeating pattern of tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, so on and so forth. Now a tone or a whole step is plus 2 frets, and a semitone or a half step is plus 1 fret. So on the A string that would look like this. So that is the diminished scale. Now to be more specific, I would call that the diminished mode of the diminished scale. Because we've got this repeating pattern of tone, semitone, tone, semitone, we can play the same scale, but instead of going tone, semitone, we can go semitone, tone, semitone, tone, and so on and so forth. So if we lead with a tone, we are playing what I call the diminished mode of the diminished scale. And if we lead with a semitone, we are playing what I call the altered dominant mode of the diminished scale, which doesn't really have anything to do with the altered scale. It's a very similar sounding scale, but it's the application that you'll see in the next section of the video why we're calling it the altered dominant. So this is the altered dominant mode of the diminished scale, starting on a semitone, tone, semitone, tone. Root. So learn to recognise the difference between those 2 modes, tone, semitone versus semitone, tone. The difference being the diminished mode of the diminished scale and the altered dominant mode of the diminished scale. Now it's not very practical to play a scale on a single string, although visually it's very helpful. So here's some alternative ways to play the scale around the neck. So this pattern is great for playing the diminished mode of the diminished scale. What we're going to do is we're going to take string pairs, and on each string pair we're going to play the same shape. We're going to go 5, 7, 8, 5, 6, 8. So it's that pattern where we're starting and finishing with the first finger and little finger, and we're either using the ring finger or the middle finger, depending on the leap in the middle. So that's the cell, and then on the next string pair, we're going to go down a fret and do the same shape. And then because this is the B string, we don't need to go down a fret anymore. We just change string and do the same shape again. So you can think of it as the same shape played 3 times on different string pairs. Now here's an easier way to play the altered dominant mode of the diminished scale, and this is a 4-note per string pattern. So we're going to start on the low E string with 5, 6, 8, 9, and we're going to take that same shape and just go up 1 fret on every string, with the exception of the B string, of course, which is going to be up 2 frets. So make sure that you can play both modes of the diminished scale, either tone semitone or semitone tone, on a single string, and then ensure that you have at least a slightly more practical way of playing each one of those. Now the great thing about the diminished scale is it's symmetrical every minor third, which means once you've learned one position, such as here in the 5th position, you can simply slide up 3 frets and play the same shape again. So it's very quick to get that scale learned all over the neck because you stay in position, then slide up 3 frets. Now, as well as learning it on a single string and in several different positions, I'd also recommend that you learn to sing the sound of the 2 modes of the diminished scale. Getting that sound world stuck in your head is the most important thing in order to use this sound effectively when you're improvising. You need to be able to hear what you're trying to play. And if you can't sing it, you don't have to be a great singer, but if you can't kind of mumble your way through the scale, it kind of suggests that your brain isn't quite comfortable with the order of these intervals yet. So let's take a moment to look at the degrees of the scale and some of the chords that we can build using the diminished scale. Now, as we discussed in Messiaen Mode 3 video, we talked about how it's always really helpful to look at what the root, the 3rd, the 5th and the 7th are in particular to get a general idea for the types of 7 chords that you can build from a particular scale. Now, with the diminished scale, we're going to look at that, but we're going to look at it on both modes. So you're going to find that one of these modes is very fruitful, whereas the other mode is slightly less fruitful, but there's still some great chords in both. So the diminished mode has the root, the 2nd, the flat 3rd, the 4th, the flat 5th or sharp 11, the sharp 5 or flat 6th, and the natural 6th or diminished 7, finished with the major 7. So any chord which is built from those degrees will accept the diminished scale played on top of it very nicely. In the altered dominant mode of the diminished scale, we have a root, a flat 9, a sharp 9, a major 3rd, a flat 5 or sharp 11, a natural 5, a natural 6th, and a flattened 7. So in the diminished mode of the diminished scale, there's really only 2 types of chord that you can use that over in its default position. One of those is, of course, the diminished chord. So any diminished 7 chord will perfectly accept the diminished scale because the diminished scale has a root, a flat 3rd, a flat 5th, and a diminished 7 in. So it's going to sound great over a diminished chord. Now, a slightly less common chord type, but still a very interesting sound, the sort of thing you'd hear in some Allan Holdsworth songs, would be the root, the flat 3rd, the flat 5th, and the major 7, which, again, is not a sound you're going to see very often, but the diminished scale has a diminished 7 and a major 7 in it, so you've actually got a choice. Do I want to use a diminished 7 or do I want to use a major 7? And we actually covered some of those sounds in the 3 diminished decorations video, which you can see up here. Now, in its altered dominant mode, we have a lot more common chords available to us, including a dominant 7 chord, a minor 7 chord, a minor 7 flat 5, a 7 flat 9, a 7 sharp 9, which is our Hendrix chord, a 7 sharp 11, and pretty much any altered tonality. However, the thing to be aware of is there isn't technically a sharp 5 or a flat 13 found in the altered dominant mode of the diminished scale. So technically it shouldn't be used over augmented chords, but I think you'll probably find it sounds pretty good in those settings as well. So because the altered dominant mode of the diminished scale in particular has so many different chord types, you'll actually find that the diminished scale can be a great scale to use to bridge 2 chords which were seemingly unrelated together. So you may see a minor 7 chord that seems completely unrelated to a dominant 7 chord in the next bar, but you'll find that actually, because of the transposing nature every minor third, you'll find that you can use the same diminished scale over 2 seemingly unrelated chords. So finally, let's look at that lick that I opened the video with. Now, we discussed in the previous video on Messiaen mode 3 how the issue with the symmetrical scales is we don't want them to sound too symmetrical, which sounds silly, but if it's just a repeating pattern up the neck, it can sound a bit samey. So we discussed a few of the methods that we can use to break up the symmetrical nature of the scale and try and move away from pattern-based playing. And we kind of discussed moving towards a more arpeggio and intervallic based playing style when using symmetrical scales, because it really breaks up the repetitive nature and it kind of keeps it sounding less easily identifiable as the diminished scale to the listener. So the first cell of this diminished lick is that diminished with the major 7 that we discussed in the harmony of this scale. So we start here on the 5th fret and we go 5, 8, 6, 6, which gives us an A diminished triad with the major 7 G sharp at the top. The second cell is this little descending line, just playing the notes of the scale, descending in minor thirds, which encircles the starting note of the next cell. So there's the encirclement there, taking us to the F. We've got G flat above it, E flat below it, up to an F. Now from that F, we're going to ascend through a diminished triad. Now for this 4th cell, we're going to slide up a semitone. And then I kind of noticed that we were in this kind of pentatonic looking pattern here. We know our pentatonic scale. And I sort of recognised that shape here, so I just wanted to have a moment to explore the pentatonic. And then instead of going back up to the 4, we now go up to the 5. Now this 5th fret here is the first note in this intervallic sequence that we're going to be using. So we're going to descend a compound semitone, or compound minor second, all the way down here to the 6th fret, and then we're going up through this arpeggio. Now again, this is a major 7 with a diminished 5th. Now from this low 4th fret, we're going to slide up to the 7th fret and ascend through the same shape we just descended through. Now that slide indicates the middle point of a reversal. This is kind of, if you think of putting a mirror in your lick, we're now going to play the same thing backwards and transposed. So this is what we'd call a retrograde sequence, where this shape here, we're now going to play somewhere else, which is sequencing, but instead of descending through it, we're going to ascend through it, which is retrograde. We're playing it backwards. And that entire previous cell, 5, 6, 6, 5, 4, we're now going to play in this new position, but backwards, as if we were playing through that phrase, reading from right to left instead of left to right. And we've just done the reverse of that compound minor second, so we're kind of back where we started on the 5th fret, but we're now on the 8th fret. And then to round the lick off, just a little slide from the 11 to the 10, and a little bend on 9, up a semitone to finish on A. So of course, like I've mentioned in many of my lick videos, you don't need to learn my lick, but hopefully by understanding how I built it, you can create your own. And by poaching other people's ideas, hopefully you've been a little bit inspired by that sound world. Go away and make your own using those same concepts. Big intervals, ascending through the less common arpeggios of the harmony, and things like retrograde and inversion, things like that. We've got all sorts of compositional tools that it's always helpful to know about those, because when you're constructing your lines, you can really make them sound interesting but cohesive, because you've taken the content that you've already used and just slightly warped it in a way that the listener doesn't understand what you've done but feels like it's a cohesive line. So hopefully you've seen some useful applications for the diminished scale here. You're going to find that something like the diminished scale is quite easy to learn at first, but actually finding where to apply it is a bit more trial and error. One of the main issues I had myself personally is remembering which mode of the diminished scale is for use over the diminished chord and which mode of the diminished scale is for use over dominant chords. So just take the time to remember the degrees of the scale when you start on a tone semitone versus when you start on a semitone tone. And just before you play, remind yourself, oh yeah, if I start on a semitone, then it's going to give me dominant sounds. And if I start on a tone, it's going to give me diminished sounds. And simply reminding yourself of that a couple of times a week, you'll eventually find these shapes fit under your fingers very nicely. But I personally was a bit afraid of using this scale because I could never quite remember which way round it worked. And of course, the solution was just to spend 2 seconds thinking of, well, what would the degrees of the scale be? And applying those over a diminished chord versus a dominant chord. So let me know down below your favourite application of the diminished scale and any other scales that you would like to see me discuss. Please do check out the playlist that you can see up here for more outside sounding sounds like this. If you like these sort of chromatic lines, then I've talked about these in detail in plenty of other videos, which you can check out up here. Please do give this video a like, subscribe, ding the notification bell, and share with any of your friends who need some diminished magic in their life. And as always, I hope you're all doing very well and getting plenty of practice in, and I very much look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers!
Roll up, let me embed a story you'll never forget. A drip, drip, but drowning in debt now. You can't buy your way out, and I heard you find it difficult to cope. Well, here by this bottle full of hope.